Ben R. Crenshaw is a postdoctoral research associate at the Declaration of Independence Center at the University of Mississippi, where he teaches courses on American politics and religion. He also holds a PhD from Hillsdale College, where he specialized in 18th-century American religious and political thought prior to and during the founding era. He has contributed works on Christian theology and on the statesmanship of Winston Churchill. He and his wife Sarah and 3-year-old son Phillip live in North Mississippi. Please welcome first Dr. Adam Rao.
Well, good morning. I see that Adam and Jonathan have been talking about federalism, which is great, but we're going to shift gears now, and we're going to talk about republicanism for a while. And so my talk is called Republicanism in Pre-Revolutionary America. As many of you may be aware, in 2018, Patrick Deneen, professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame, published his best-selling book, Why Liberalism Failed. In this book, Deneen advanced the thesis that America had been founded as a liberal political regime, a limited government that represents and protects the rights of the people, but that liberalism contained the seeds of its own destruction, seeds that have since germinated, grown, matured, and produced its deadly fruit of civilizational atomism and collapse. In surprising fashion, however, Deneen lumped Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and the founders of America together as liberals. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Deneen never cited the American founders in their own words as being liberals or as espousing so-called liberal beliefs or principles. So this naturally opens the following question. Did the American founders think of themselves as liberals? If you had showed up in 1776 or 1787 and asked George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, or countless others, are you liberals? What do you think about liberalism? Their answer to you would undoubtedly have been, what is a liberal? The American founders were not self-conscious liberals. While you will find an occasional reference to liberal or liberalism in the writings of the founders, such as some of George Washington's letters, these are almost always references to an expansive and liberal education or mindset that would widen people's intellects and horizons. If our founders were not liberals, then what were they? What did they call themselves? Well, they were Republicans. They were Republicans, small r, not the political party, but Republicans who belonged to a republic. So then the question becomes, what is republicanism? Now, we could consider the venerable Greek idea of the res publica, the thing of the people, or the people's thing. Republican government has something to do with the people. It comes from them, or is directed by them, or works for their benefit, or something of this nature. But we could also look closer to home by consulting John Adams. Adams, in his April 1776 pamphlet, Thoughts on Government, made a number of very poignant and interesting observations about the nature of American government. But he leads up to this ringing conclusion. He says, quote, "There is no good government but what is Republican," end quote. Thus, good government is Republican government. And what is Republican government? Adams tells us, quote, "The very definition of a republic is an empire of laws and not of men," end quote. Now, by this, Adams did not mean the absurd. He did not mean that Republican government comes down from heaven by God or is delivered by angels or is spontaneous in nature. In other words, that good government excludes the efforts and involvement of men. No, laws by definition are made by men. So the Republican government Adam has in mind is human government. But by law, in contrast to men, Adams simply meant that which is right and just versus that which is arbitrary and capricious. So Adams' argument is that Republican government is just government. Good, but this still does not give us many details as to what the founding generation believed Republican government contained or implies. So in other words, we want more details still. Now, I don't often invoke Abraham Lincoln in talks on the American founding because while Lincoln was a great statesman, it's not good practice to use him as a heuristic to understand America's founding. However, I will make an exception in this case because I think his words at the end of the Gettysburg Address are fitting for our investigation of Republican government. And this is what Lincoln has to say, quote, "That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." So in this talk, I want to focus on government of the people, by the people, for the people as an apt description of Republican government. Of the people refers to the origins of government, by the people refers to the form of government, and for the people refers to the ends of government. So for the remainder of my talk, I'm going to speak on the nature of Republican government by considering the origins, forms, and ends of government, although I'm going to do it in a slightly different order. I will start with the origins, then go to the ends, and then talk about the form. And additionally, I'm going to do this primarily by looking at the thought of Reverend Jonathan Mayhew, who was a very important congregational minister in Boston prior to the Revolution. He died in 1766, just after the Stamp Act crisis concluded. And Adams names Mayhew as one of the leading intellectuals in the Boston revolutionary scene, along with Sam Adams, James Otis, Reverend Samuel Cooper, and many others. So although he was a minister, Mayhew wrote and preached often on political matters. And because he was less of an innovative political thinker and more of an enforcer of traditional social and political mores, Mayhew can serve as an excellent representative of the New England consensus regarding government. And then one more thing on Mayhew. One might object that since Mayhew died over a decade before the Revolution, he cannot truly be considered a representative of what the founders of America believed. I mean, was he really a founder? That's the question. In reality, though, this objection fails because, number one, his contemporaries and those who came immediately after him considered him a founder. And two, the ideas that animated and guided the American founding did not occur in a vacuum. And more importantly, they were not primarily, in my opinion, imported from Europe. Instead, Americans drew upon over 150 years of colonial history and political experience in successfully prosecuting their war and winning their independence from Britain, and then establishing their own constitutional governments. So, with these things in mind, let's consider the state of Republican government in the pre-revolutionary years, and we will start with the origins of government. Where does government come from? There are many answers to this question. But the founders' answer was unanimous. Government comes by the consent of the people. Listen to Mayhew in his 1754 election sermon before Massachusetts Governor William Shirley. Quote, "All the different constitutions of governments now in the world are immediately the creatures of man's making, not of God's. And indeed, the vestiges of human imperfections are so manifest in them that it would be a reproach to the all-wise God to attribute them directly to him. And as they are the creatures of man's making, so from man, from common consent, it is that lawful rulers immediately receive their power. This is the channel in which it flows from God, the original source of it." End quote. Mayhew never elaborated on what he meant by quote-unquote common consent in terms of who was doing the consenting or what was meant by common or the mechanism by which consent in popular government was to be registered. However, we know that the Massachusetts Bay Colony had long practiced a form of Republican government. Shortly after arriving in the Bay Area in the summer of 1630, the Venerable John Winthrop called a meeting in October of that year between himself and the 7 company members. And these 7 company members had been given plenary power by the charter to make all the decisions in the colony. And he called this meeting to discuss establishing a government. And what Winthrop proposed was unthinkable: to allow the quote-unquote freemen of the colony to elect the assistants, i.e. their representatives, who in turn would choose a governor and deputy governor, who, the governor, deputy governor, and the assistants, would then administer the political affairs of the colony. Now listen to how scholar Edmund Morgan describes the revolutionary effect of this political act. Quote, "By general vote of the people of Massachusetts, the assistants were transformed from an executive council into a legislative assembly. And the term freeman was transformed from a designation for the members of a commercial company exercising legislative and judicial control over that company and its property into a designation for the citizens of a state with the right to vote and hold office. This, in fact, is the origin of representative Republican government in Massachusetts." And yes, somebody could object about the Mayflower Compact, ask a question about that, we could debate it. In 1644, not even 15 years later, the legislative body in Massachusetts split into a bicameral chamber. Henceforth, the Massachusetts General Court would consist of 2 chambers, the upper house, the Senate, and the lower house, the House of Representatives. Thus, by Mayhew's era in the 1750s and 60s, representative government by the consent of the people was well over 100 years old in Massachusetts. Those who were consenting, however, were still the freemen. This is kind of a technical term in British and colonial American history. Adult males in the colony who were established inhabitants. They were not criminals or troublemakers. They owned property, which was typically a freeholding estate worth 40 shillings per the 1691 charter. And this idea of the freemen having the franchise may be unsatisfying to our egalitarian sensibilities, but it is still a legitimate form of consensual government by the people. The freemen were represented by the assistants, their representatives in the legislature, and then the freemen in turn represented all the non-voting people of the colony, their wives and children, single women, adolescents, non-property holders, and so forth. This form of representative Republican government is less likely to be arbitrary, as the people have a say in those who administer their government, and the people are not just any rabble, but responsible property-owning men who are free and supposedly upstanding citizens in society. Now, all of this is well and good. However, there's a further wrinkle. Does government merely come from the people? Are the people free to create whatever government they want for whatever ends they want, or mold government into whatever form they desire? In other words, are the people alone sovereign? Are they alone the source or fount of political authority and legitimacy? Mayhew's answer to this was no. He believed that government was also an ordinance of God, just as much as it came by the consent and the will of men. Listen to Mayhew, quote, "Government is spoken of in Scripture as being both the ordinance of God and the ordinance of men. Of God in reference to his original plan and universal providence, and of man as it is more immediately the result of human prudence, wisdom, and concert." Now, how are we to put these together? How can government come both from God on the one hand and from men on the other? Are these not mutually exclusive, or at least somehow in conflict? In short, Mayhew, and he was certainly not alone in this, believed that a political authority and power ultimately comes from God in terms of its kind of design, its original design, but mediately or immediately comes from men. Quote, "But it is to be remembered that this political power is derived from God, not immediately, but mediately, as other talents and blessings are." And then again, Mayhew, quote, "Not that any rulers have their commission immediately from God, the supreme Lord of the universe. Instead, rulers derive their authority immediately not from God, but from men." Now, Mayhew was one of many in the pre-revolutionary years who believed that men are not absolutely sovereign in establishing their own governments. It is true, government cannot be established without the rational planning and effort of men. But to have legitimate government that is not arbitrary and capricious, serving the few while enslaving the many, there must be a higher source of power of law than merely the opinions of men. Mayhew believed that political authority derived from God, who was himself the supreme ruler of the universe. But instead of God hand-selecting a king or ruling directly himself through a priestly class, political power devolved from God to the people collectively. From there, men had both the right and ability to establish their own governments through their common consent and rational deliberations. So much for the origins of government. Now let's turn to the ends of government. The liberal account of government tends to collapse all the ends of government into a single end, the protection of the natural rights of citizens. To be clear, Republican government does require the protection of the rights of men, but it also does more than this. What did Mayhew think? He agreed that government is partially established for the protection of men's natural rights. In speaking on the very famous passage about government in Romans 13, Mayhew declared this, quote, "According to St. Paul, the magistrate is ordained of God for a terror to evildoers and for a praise to them that do well. His office is to preserve the liberties and natural rights of his subjects, one of the most important of which is the rights of that of private judgment and an unmolested enjoyment of man's own religion." Jonathan talked about that. Elsewhere, Mayhew said this. He spoke in favor of, quote, "the defense of the natural and legal rights of the people against the unnatural and illegal encroachments of arbitrary power." Yet Mayhew, like virtually every other political thinker or statesman in the pre-revolutionary years, believed that government was primarily established for one overriding purpose, to uphold and defend the public welfare, what we talk about today as the common good. Mayhew asserted this, quote, "The end of magistracy is the good of civil society. The sole end of all government is the good of society." And he also said the usefulness of human society is determined by its subservience to the general welfare. What did Mayhew mean by the public welfare or the good of society? Well, basically everything. Physical protection of the community against external invasion and internal convulsions, the guarantee of the people's rights and liberties, both their natural rights and the inherited rights of Englishmen, the promotion of true religion, the cultivation of piety and virtue, the establishment of peace and tranquility, the support of honest trades and productive commerce, and so forth. And if you wanted to look at the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which its final version authored by John Adams, he does a very good job there of defining the common good as the protection, safety, prosperity, and happiness of the people. And so this leads us to the next end of government. Republican government in the 18th century also included another very important end, perhaps the highest end. Not the first end, mind you, but the highest end, the happiness of the people. Returning to John Adams in his thoughts on governments, Adams had this to say about the end of government, quote, "We ought to consider what is the end of government before we determine which is the best form." Keep that in mind. That'll be important, and we'll return to it. End and form of government are related. Upon this point, all speculative politicians will agree that the happiness of society is the end of government, as all divines and moral philosophers will agree that the happiness of the individual is the end of man. End quote. Mayhew would not have disagreed. In his 1754 election sermon, Mayhew concluded that, quote, "The end of government then, as a divine ordinance, must be human felicity. In fact, since government is both a divine ordinance of God, is both a divine ordinance and God is perfectly good, it could not be any other way." Here's Mayhew again, quote, "It is not conceivable that the all-wise and good God should ordain government among men, but with a view to its being subservient to their happiness and well-being in the world. To be sure, not that it may be subservient to a contrary one, their misery." Government is not supposed to make you miserable. Pretty basic. Yet this does not tell us what happiness is. What makes for a happy life? Is it a quote unquote life well lived? And what is a life well lived? Who decides? Is this an open invitation for every person to define their own understanding of happiness and then pursue it with the expectation that law and society must not only permit this but actively support it? Well, Mayhew also helps us in this regard, for he developed a very thorough assessment of the nature of human happiness. Happiness for him consisted in both temporal and earthly goods, but also spiritual and eternal goods. And this had four parts that I'll run through briefly. Number one, civil virtue and happiness. Number two, magisterial happiness. Number three, a kind of spiritual or eternal happiness. And number four, rational happiness and the body politic. So we'll take these one at a time. Civil virtue and happiness. For Mayhew, one could not be vicious, wicked, and miserly and still be happy. Quote, "We find that virtue is the road to felicity and vice to misery." Mayhew also argued that according to the natural fitness between virtue and happiness, and that men, through observation and experience, can readily see the close connection between them. Quote, "There is really no necessity of going so far to find our obligation to what is usually called moral virtue, as to consider its tendency to happiness, its rendering us like to God the standard of perfection." End quote. For Mayhew, as a minister, the virtue of charity or love was the highest virtue. Quote, "Love is a spirit that cements mankind together and preserves that order and harmony among them, which is requisite in order to the general safety and welfare." End quote. If the love of men and society fails, Mayhew warned of trouble. Quote, "Let this Catholic and universal principle be once destroyed," that is love, "and confusion, discord, and the crush of worlds inevitably follow. Without the virtues in general and charity in particular, men cannot be happy." Number two, magisterial happiness. Mayhew also acknowledged that social happiness was, to a great extent, dependent upon the character and good rule of the civil magistrate. One might have all the virtues and be blameless in their conduct, and yet still have their life and happiness in this world destroyed by reckless, selfish, or malicious rulers and corrupt laws. Instead, civil rulers ought to, quote, imitate the justice and unwearied goodness of God, such that, quote, when they prosecute the true interests of the public and diffuse happiness around them, then and only then do they act up to their honorable character. Thus, for Mayhew to live under good rulers in a well-ordered and wisely administered civil government with good civil law would be a great boon and blessing to human happiness. Number 3, spiritual or eternal happiness. Mayhew spoke of religious and eternal happiness more than any other kind. He's a minister, of course. True happiness is found in obeying God's commands, since, quote, the ultimate design of all divine commandments is our mutual happiness, end quote. But religious happiness is not just following divine commands. Rationally discerning and following God's design, as seen in the world, is also paramount. Quote, the order which God and nature hath pointed out to us is most conducive to the general happiness of mankind, because the order established by God can never thwart or interfere with the good of his creatures, end quote. To go against God's design in nature is to spell disaster. Quote, to break in upon the order of nature or to act out of our proper sphere can never issue in greater happiness to ourselves or others than keeping strictly to both, end quote. To defy God's commands or his natural law is to invite unhappiness and misery. Fourth, the rational happiness of the body politic. Finally, Mayhew believed that private happiness and public happiness, when understood properly and practiced well, would not conflict. Quote, that which tends to public good tends to private good also. To support the contrary is a manifest contradiction, for public happiness is increased no farther than the happiness of the individuals is also. And if the world be under the government of a righteous and wise providence, those must, in the final result of things, be found best to have contributed their own interest, who have been the most industrious to advance the happiness of others. True happiness, therefore, is not a zero-sum game, but a benefit not only to individuals, but to society at large. To truly be happy, you must look beyond yourself to love others. Therefore, for Mayhew, as well as the founders of America, the ends of Republican government were many. The protection of the public good, of civil society, from both anarchy and tyranny, as well as the promotion of peace, safeguarding the rights and liberties of the people in their proper expression and practice, and most of all, the promotion of earthly and eternal happiness of the people. Third, and finally, I want to talk briefly about the form of government. Now, so far, we have been discussing Republican government as it is by the people and for the people. But what of government of the people? Once government is established and its proper ends adjudicated, what about its actual administration? What role do the people play in their res publica, and their republic? We could, of course, review the classical taxonomy of different forms of government and what distinguishes them. Aristocracy, timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny for Plato in kind of descending order. Monarchy, aristocracy, polity, all of which are good on the one hand, and their counterparts of tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, all of which are bad on the other hand for Aristotle. But in all of this, the question that arises is the following. Is a republic a form of government? Is it a regime type? Or is it something larger, something different? Meaning, does it exist at the level of the genus or the species? Returning once again to John Adams and his thoughts on government, Adams declared confidently that, quote, of republics there is an inexhaustible variety, because the possible combinations of the powers of society are capable of innumerable variation. What of Mayhew? Listen to him here. Quote, the essence of government, I mean good government, consists in the making and executing of good laws, laws attempered to the common felicity of the government. Good government is good laws which leads to the happiness of the people. And if this be done, it is evidently in itself a thing of no consequence at all what the particular form of government is, whether the legislative and executive powers be lodged in one and the same person or in different persons, whether in one person whom we shall call an absolute monarch, whether in a few as to constitute an aristocracy, whether in many as to constitute a democracy, or whether in three coordinate branches in such manner as to make the government partake something of each of these forms, a mixed government, and to be, at the same time, essentially different from them all. If the end is attained, it is enough. The end of government is more important than the form. Here we find Mayhew arguing, as John Adams did at the beginning, that legitimate government is Republican government, a government of laws, not of men, and that laws are good only so far as they attain for and accomplish the proper ends of government, the common felicity or happiness of the people. If Republican government is that which is of the people and for the people, then certain forms of government that exclude the people's consent or, on the other hand, that exploit, defraud, and enslave them are not legitimate. This would include, like illegitimate forms of government would include oligarchy, the government of the wealthy for the sake of those few wealthy, tyranny, the government of one for its own sake, and a plebiscitary mobocracy, a government of the many that's anarchic and chaotic, which, if you read the founders like Madison, they will say that democracy has that characteristic at times. So Mayhew's view that republicanism was compatible with a variety of legitimate forms of government, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, it was very common in the mid-18th century. This highlights his and others' emphasis upon achieving the ends of government first and foremost. As the Aristotelians among us know quite well, the form of a thing must be commensurate with its end. In other words, while the end logically precedes the form and so determines its shape, the form is temporally antecedent and is the means by which the end is achieved. In this case, while the proper ends of Republican government determine the acceptable range of political forms or regime types, what determines which form should be implemented will be contingent. The character, habits, dispositions, the capacities of the people, the geography and terrain, the status of other great powers nearby, the political history and inherited traditions that have been honored and passed down, and so forth. Like Montesquieu before them, the founders believed that for a government to be good, it had to fit the particular people it was established for. Therefore, in America today, while we are obsessed with democracy, Mayhew and other founders were not. They, in fact, were most skeptical of democracy and sought to weave elements of monarchy and aristocracy into our Constitution in order to create a more stable mix. So in conclusion, this short talk has attempted to articulate an older and often forgotten understanding of Republican government. Republican government is a government of good laws, not the arbitrary and selfish dealings of kleptocratic and gerontocratic oligarchs scheming how they might enrich themselves off the people. In contrast, a Republican government is of the people. It comes through their consent, even if political authority ultimately is of God. It is by the people. While its form is flexible, it is the arrangement of branches, departments, and offices that must be responsive to the needs of the people and facilitate the legitimate ends of government. And it is for the people. Its ends are the welfare of all, not just the few, the protection of society from internal and external threats, and ultimately, to support the people in attaining their happiness. Now, while I could close with a quote from Mayhew, I want to instead turn to his ministerial compatriot, the Reverend Samuel Cook, who in his 1770 election sermon before Governor Thomas Hutchinson had this to say, quote, "Justice requires of rulers in their legitimate legislative capacity that they attend to the operations of their own acts and repeal whatever laws, upon an impartial review, they find to be inconsistent with the laws of God, the rights of men, and the general benefit of society. This the community hath a right to expect." Thank you.
Join us in falling in love with America again.